A court in China has sentenced an activist to 7.5 years in prison for subverting state power. The Chinese government has detained several activists and lawyers this year. Activists say it's a sweeping crackdown on dissent. Are they right? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Chinese authorities are cracking down on activists they say are undermining the government. Several lawyers and professors are in court this week facing charges like damaging national security and harming social stability. And the government says some of them have been trained and supported by Western governments, a charge to which a few defendants have confessed. But critics say those confessions were likely forced and that trials this week have been unfairly closed to the public. We have lots to discuss, but first this report from Adrian Brown in the northern Chinese city of Tangen.
Hu Shegun knows what awaits him. Before his arrest last July, he'd already spent 14 years in jail for challenging Communist Party rule, and that counted against him here. He admitted leading an underground organization that encouraged illegal protests. On Tuesday, another dissident confessed to the same crime, but received only a 3-year suspended jail term. The campaign against dissent is being led by President Xi Jinping.
We have evidence to show that Xi Jinping is using this weapon of nationalism to frame human rights lawyers and dissidents as troublemakers because they are being supported by the US government or other hostile and anti-China forces.
Most foreign media were barred from covering the trial. Police prevented some journalists from even standing 300 meters from the building where a trial described as open was taking place. Can we take a picture of the court? At one stage, more than 20 police surrounded us. They were polite but firm. It felt like detention, but with a smile. We were escorted away with police cameras recording our every move. Invited to board a bus and then driven away. Well, this gives you a pretty good idea of just how sensitive this case is. We've now been put on a bus that's taking us to a 5-star hotel where a media centre has been established, and that's as close as we're going to get to the court today. In the executive lounge, a live transcript of the proceedings was projected onto a screen. Evidence that can't be independently verified. At least 20 other activists are still being held. Their fate will also be determined by China's courts. Adrian Brown, Al Jazeera, Tianjin.
This week's trials on dissent are the first in China since the crackdown began last year. More than 300 lawyers and activists were initially arrested in June 2015. Most were released, but about 20 are still in jail. Last month, authorities purged top editorial staff at a long-running liberal journal called Yang Huan Chunqiu. Censors have shut dozens of history-themed social media accounts for spreading what the government calls unhealthy information. And a leaked government file from 2013 shows Chinese officials often see civil society groups as a tool of the West and a serious threat to the ruling party. Well, let's bring in our guests for today's discussion in Beijing. Einar, political affairs analyst in Hong Kong. Roseann Rife, East Asia Research Director at Amnesty International. And in Nottingham in the UK, Samantha Hoffman, an independent China analyst and research consultant. Welcome to all of you. Einar, let me bring you in first. What's the response there to what we've seen over the past year, and particularly in light to the most recent sentencing?
Well, you're seeing very little in the press on this, obviously, and you probably will not be a very large reaction. This is mostly limited to those people who are involved or dissatisfied with the status quo.
I mean, why is there such little interest? It's a big thing. It's seen as clamping down on human rights. I mean, we can understand possibly why the media is not covering it, because we've seen a lot of clamping down on the media too. Is that what's behind it?
No, you have to remember that while we're looking at this in a microcosm, right now in China, most people's attention is turned towards the East and South China Sea, where there you have a situation where nationalism is taking a very firm hold, and the belief that these are firmly, lands firmly within China's control.
Would that make sense as far as the timing of these cases is concerned then?
Well, yes. I mean, with people's attention diverted, there's certainly going to be less attention paid to this. But you have to understand, in many senses, within China, there is a respect for a strength. And in this particular case, you have a situation where there have been people who've been going against the system, whether it's coerced or deliberate or was part of a plan. The issue here is that to be a dissident, you really have to try to attract attention. And in this particular case, they succeeded, and now they're being published. This is something that China sees as entirely in an internal matter, much the way the U.S. would see, gun ownership and other things.
Roseann, Rife, I mean, what is your response to the fact that nobody really seems to care in China about these trials, about the clampdown?
Well, I think the thing to keep in mind in both of those stories, both the South China Sea as well as the year-long crackdown on lawyers and activists, is the narrative that's being presented to the public in China is very much controlled by the Chinese government and the Chinese authorities. So they're presenting their side of the issue or the story and really forming public opinion on it. If you look at how much effort has gone into the televised confessions of some of these lawyers and activists, and the narrative of where the blame has been placed, I think that's why it's not receiving quite as much attention. Likewise, the government can increase attention to stories that it wants to get some more public support, or at least be seen externally to have public support behind them.
And Samantha, possibly proof of the control that the government now has over so many organizations, over word getting out.
I think that what we're seeing isn't actually a new crackdown. It's actually the extension of long existing policy. So anybody seen as spreading rumors or slandering the government or any means of subverting state power, even if it's completely innocent, are a threat to the party. And that's long existing policy, but I think that the state's legal framework for enforcing it, as well as their technological abilities, have also increased. And so it's not really a new crackdown, it's a long existing
because Samantha,
policy.
if you look at who is prey to this crackdown, I mean, it seems like a rather random group of people. What is it that they have in common?
I think they're all people who have a vision of China that isn't what the CCP defines as China. So they see a slightly different version of China. They don't necessarily want to overthrow the government, but the party sees their narrative as a threat to its narrative. And so anybody who's an NGO, activist, researcher, journalist, put themselves at a higher risk because they might be putting forward a narrative that is seen as a threat to the party's constructed Leninist system.
Roseann, let me bring up 2 points. What Einar said, that many of these who stand trial have to go out of their way, really, to draw attention to themselves. Do you think that's true? And tell us a little bit more about the confessions that we heard and that you touched on.
I mean, I think one of the actual fears of the government is some of these individuals have been able to garner a certain amount of attention from the public, whether it's through their work in helping petitioners or even their comments and actions online through social media, on Weibo, the Chinese Twitter-like medium. I think that's really what the government fears, as Samantha was saying. I think it's any narrative that runs counter to what the government is trying to accomplish, and also something that they see as a threat. So if these individuals are getting any kind of attention or showing some sort of organization behind them where they've got some numbers, I think that's when the government sees it as a threat and really tries to curtail it. And you see that in things like how in some of these trials the number of times posts are reposted on Twitter or the social media accounts. These are the kinds of things that are raised. So anything that garners a certain amount of attention does attract the government's attention. So I think that even though you see people who are working on different issues, whether it's environmental issues or freedom of religion or petitioning, you know, they may be doing different things, but their narrative is counter to the government's, and they have the potential to draw some attention from like-minded people within their own communities and even nationwide.
Okay, talk about drawing attention, and Einar, this is going to be to you. I want to talk about a couple of videos that we saw released on Monday, released by the government, by the Communist Party, and they show, and I'm drawing comments from the video and some of the images that we saw, showing Wang Yu, one of the country's most respected human rights lawyers, confessing to having been trained by foreign forces to attack and smear the Chinese government. We've also saw die-hard lawyers, as they were described, accused of being part of a Western-backed plot to topple the government. Why do you think the government has to resort to this type of what is seen as propaganda?
Well, quite frankly, China sees itself under threat right now, both externally in terms of issues like the South China Sea. They definitely blame the U.S. as being behind what they see as a kind of a charade backed by Japan and the Philippines to threaten what is in essence the lifeblood of China. Remember, it's unlikely that China would interfere with freedom of navigation of the seas, given that it's on the low end of the per person resource list. It's dependent entirely on resources coming into China and then the ability to ship value-added goods outside to other markets. So they see a lot of bugbears out there. And then internally, as the economy of the world continues to kind of languish, and there's increasing pressure on China to kind of pull things along, they see this as very, very threatening internally to the kind of peace and stability that they've been trying to push together. Now, in terms of one of your other questions, I just wanted to make a comment. It's fine to say that these the dissidents, you know, seem to be from all walks of life, but from the Chinese perspective, it's a communal idea. The idea that you work within the community. If you decide to be a rebel and go outside, throughout Chinese literature and history, this is always marked by in most cases, very harsh punishments, generally loss of life, perhaps of your entire village or large swaths of areas and things like this. So you have to keep in mind that this is a different culture. They view Western media, also a lot of Western ideas, especially democracy, as not being well-founded. They're looking at things like the Arab Spring, the other experiments most recently with democracy that have not gone well. And they're looking at the United States, the economic meltdown that has led to the current malaise, and also the presidential politics. So there's not a resounding endorsement that can be made for a lot of the kind of ideas that have been pushed by the West in terms of their success. And China is saying quite bluntly, it says, we don't want that here. And if you try to push that in, either as a foreign government or somebody from within China expressing these ideas, that you're going to be punished.
All right, I'm going to talk about the South China Sea in a minute, but Samantha, I just want to pick up on some of the points made there. I mean, is a lot of this got to do with democracy, the fact that it doesn't really, as far as the Chinese leadership is concerned, have a home there? I mean, going back to those videos again, the lawyers are linked to the upheavals in Syria and Egypt and Ukraine. It's blamed on rebelling against leadership. So is that what's going on here? A revulsion of democracy and regime change? That's to Samantha.
I mean, if you look at most unrest in in China, most of it isn't targeted towards regime change. Most of it is about everyday issues, land grabs or unpaid wages and things like that. But these groups that are being targeted, they might be interested in labor rights or women's rights and legal rights. And again, those are all things that it would make sense that if the CCP worked with them, that would help to ensure its power in the long term. But the fear is that working with them could erode power in a sense. I think that there isn't really strong evidence that the West is interfering. Certainly it's the narrative that China is pushing, but part of the reason for that, it's not just nationalism or getting the domestic audience to see the issue in the way that the party wants to see it. It's also about China trying to play a larger role in really redesigning the international system. So if you think about China's response to the South China Sea ruling, I think we tend to focus on what that might mean for the potential for armed conflict in the South China Sea, and that's a legitimate question. But perhaps we should be more focused on China's use of language and what that means for how it might be trying to change international institutions. The best example for me to think about is China's network security policy. And much like Russia, China pushes the concept of internet sovereignty, and that's palatable to us in the West in a way, because that's focused on ensuring that the state's laws are respected in the international system. But really, in China's definition of what state security is, that's political security and ensuring party state security. So network security, for example.
Okay, let me bring Roseann in, because Roseann, you were trying to say something a little earlier on when it came to democracy, and also you were nodding away when Samantha was talking about internet security and how the cyber warfare is being used at the moment. Talk us through that.
I do very much appreciate that point, that it's all about the language and how China is framing it. I don't think we should forget the fact that the Chinese government has signed on to human rights. It's recognized in the Constitution. China has signed into the human rights treaty system in the UN and definitely engages in that. But I think they are also, as Samantha was just saying, trying to sort of give their twist to how they think it should be interpreted and push their own agenda. That internet sovereignty is something I had mentioned earlier. I think that's the way to approach it. And one of the interesting things I think they're talking about or approaching that issue right now is in the sense of privacy, the right to privacy. There's quite a bit of that mentioned in the new cybersecurity law, but it's not the real motivation, I feel, behind this new law and the clauses in it. I think it is very much a way to control what is discussed on the internet and really, again, solidify their power on what can be discussed there and what views can be, voiced. And so I think that we do have to be very, very careful with that language. This narrative that human rights is a Western point is not really valid, I don't think.
Well, let's talk about China's global relations at the moment. We've been discussing how it's becoming increasingly strained over the past year. That tension revolves around the South China Sea. It's a territory that includes oil and gas fields, rich fishing grounds, and it's a vital shipping route. China claims 90% of the area, but 5 other countries dispute that claim. The United States has openly opposed China's control of the waters. Last month, an international tribunal at The Hague said there's no legal basis for China's claim of sovereignty in the South China Sea. So this plays into a lot of, obviously, what we've been talking to, different viewpoints here. And I mean, how's this eventually going to play out? Will China succumb to international pressure at the moment?
No, China will not succumb to international pressure, and unfortunately, it'll react in in the exact opposite way. This kind of saber-rattling gunboat diplomacy on both sides is inching the world closer to a catastrophe. If you look historically at World War I, this was the same kind of situation. You had a very dominant Great Britain that was trying to contain a rising Germany. And both sides said war was impossible, that it was just a matter of kind of forcing things and pushing things. And unfortunately, it didn't work out very well, and there are a lot of lives lost, and that led to the Second World War. We need to kind of stand back a little bit and look and understand that unlike that period of time, you're facing an additional element, and that is a class of cultures. I mean, in the West, we look at things, I'm a lawyer, I look at things from a legalistic point of view, the rule of law, the idea that you have a clash, that there's a winner and a loser that's decided by a court or a tribunal. In the East, it is a little bit different. They try to look at things from a consensus point of view. If you look at ASEAN, ASEAN will not take a stand unless everybody is in consensus and agrees on it. And this kind of difference in opinion and approach is continuing to mark the kind of boundaries of understanding and the ability to move forward.
All right, Roseann, I just want to know what your response is there. I mean, you know, this language, I mean, does it allow then for human rights abuses to happen? Because there is a different viewpoint when it comes to culture, or there are different cultures, a different viewpoints of language. And I'm wondering what sort of, at the same time, what sort of pressure the G20 meeting that's coming up can put on China, if any at all.
Well, I think that China does react to international pressure. You can see it in the way they frame arguments. You can see it in the change in tactics, even in the trials this week. The fact that there were a number of media organizations invited into the trial, very selected media organizations, but nonetheless some were invited in, which is something new. We haven't seen that before. And I do think that is a reaction to criticism and a demonstration of them trying to adapt to counter some of the criticism that they're getting. So I don't think we can blanketly say they don't react to international pressure. They do. I think it's just we have to recognize the limits and try to listen to the comments that are coming back and you know, hold them to the things they have already, you know, signed up for. The Chinese government has made commitments to, you know, human rights in the international community, and those are the things we keep focusing on.
And Samantha, what do you think is going to happen at the G20 meeting next month? The potential for more unrest in the country after these draconian measures and what we're seeing on the South China Sea?
I think that obviously there needs to be pressure on China concerning issues like the South China Sea, but the real policy changes are more long-term, and that's the same thing we were reiterating before about language. And China's concept of human rights is very different from our concept of human rights. And so they've signed on to these conventions, but the definitions of these things are very different. So in order to engage in a more constructive dialogue, we need to read Chinese media and read what the Chinese Communist Party is saying in order to understand its policies, and that's how in the long term we'll be able to avoid conflict, I think. But in terms of the risk of massive social upheaval, I don't think that it's there. I don't think that, I mean, one of the things that I do is I collect a database on over 10,000 protests in China over the last 5 years. And it's interesting because there's almost no evidence in those protests that anybody is interested in overthrowing the party. But I don't think that matters, and I don't think the number of protests matters. I think it's the government's fear and how it reacts to the protests. And though I don't see the Communist Party losing power anytime soon, but I see that it's constantly trying to manage something and making it more difficult to handle these challenges over time.
Well, very good to get all three of your viewpoints. I'm afraid, sorry, Samantha, I'm going to have to cut you off there. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Very good to get your thoughts, Samantha Hoffman, Roseann Rife, and Einar Tangen. And thank you as well for watching. If you fancy watching the program again, anytime, you can visit our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also, of course, join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Jane Dutton, the rest of the team, bye.